Good morning and welcome to Women, Gender, and Genesis presented by Dr. Christine Mitchell. This seminar is part of a series offered by Knox College, and today's webinar is the last of the semester. Look for more seminars coming in the fall. My name is Megan Chin, and I'm a graduate of Knox College, and I graduated in 2016. I'll be your moderator for this event. We're glad you're here, and we look forward to learning together. Soon we'll hear from Christine Mitchell, and following her presentation, we hope to have time for some questions. Please use the Q&A section of the chat to type your questions. We are recording this event, and in a week or so, you'll receive access to the recording as well as to a variety of resources. Now we wish to acknowledge the land on which Knox College operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Our speaker today, Christine Mitchell, joins Knox College in 2022 as Academic Dean and Professor of Hebrew Bible. She's a scholar of the Hebrew Bible with particular interest in 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Haggai, Zedekiah, Malachi, and the Book of Judges. With degrees in Near Eastern archaeology, religious studies, and comparative literary studies, she brings interdisciplinary perspectives to the study of biblical texts, biblical worlds, and modern interpretation. When working with modern interpretive methods, she's interested in feminist and gender studies, and especially in how settler Canadians approach biblical studies in the era of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Christine is a United Church of Canada layperson. She previously served for 19 years as professor of Hebrew Scriptures at St. Andrew's College in Saskatoon, a theological school of the United Church. Her personal website is christine-mitchell.ca, where you can find links to her publications. She's also active on Biblical Studies Twitter, and you'll see these links appear in the chat. Now, Christine, welcome, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you. Thank you, Megan. Thank you to Knox College for inviting me to speak. So thank all of you for coming and for being here today on this International Women's Day to talk about questions of women, gender, and Genesis. So I'm planning to talk for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then happy to answer as many questions as I can for the rest of our time. And you will be getting a follow-up email, and so I will try to answer any questions we don't get to in that email. So what I want to do in my presentation this morning is do three things. I want to begin with a brief discussion of the stages and types of feminist scholarship on the Hebrew Bible the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, or actually the entire Christian Bible, Old Testament and New Testament. So I'll do that a little bit. And then I want to do a little reading of Genesis 1 and then a reading of Genesis 2. And this material is material that I've taught for many years in 2 different courses when I was at St. Andrew's. So I did a course on feminist readings of the Book of Judges, which I've reworked a bit and will be offered here at Knox in the winter 24 semester. And then also I also did something very close to this presentation in my course on the creation stories in the Book of Genesis. So I've taught this material to a variety of different kinds of audiences, not just students in courses, but also some public presentations and continuing education events. So I hope that gives you a little bit of a sense of where I'm coming from and what I will be doing in this presentation. So now, okay. So as we think about stages or types of feminist biblical scholarship, although what I want to get across is although they kind of work chronologically, there's stages, things that happen at one period of time, and then the next decade we're doing something else. But the kinds of feminist biblical scholarship that happen in earlier stages continues to happen. And so what I want to do in my readings of Genesis 1 and 2 is show some of the interplay of the different stages, which now become types of feminist biblical scholarship. Those of you who have done feminist biblical or feminist theological studies or have some knowledge of feminist studies more generally, this will be very introductory to you, and so hopefully you don't get too bored as I'm presenting it. So the first kind of feminist biblical scholarship that we have is what we often call the hermeneutics of recuperation. And this is a picture of Phyllis Tribble that is extremely pixelated on your screen because I wanted to get one of her in her younger years, although she's still alive. She's now 90. But I wanted to get a picture of her in her younger years, and those kind of pixelate. So this hermeneutics of recuperation is really related to what broader feminist studies or the feminist movement would call first wave feminism, which is actually many decades earlier than when Phyllis Tribble was working. Phyllis Tribble started working in this area in the 1970s. First wave feminism is really related to the suffrage movements of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So the hermeneutics of recuperation really takes off in biblical scholarship not until several decades later. And Phyllis Tribble is really the pioneer in this area. And the fact that she's still alive tells us that this, in the grand scheme of things, didn't happen all that long ago. But what the hermeneutics of recuperation tries to do is seeks to liberate, retrieve, or redeem women's stories in the Bible to find role models, for instance, for women today. And the way you can think about sort of the catchphrase for the hermeneutics of recuperation is that the Bible is woman-friendly. You've just been reading it wrongly, or we've just been reading it wrongly. The Bible really is friendly to women. We just haven't been reading it right. So the hermeneutics of recuperation doesn't usually challenge biblical authority. And so it is very amenable to continued use in church and synagogue. And so you'll hear, so all these sorts of books that you can find in bookstores or on Amazon or whatever, something, models from the Bible for women today. Those are often related to the hermeneutics of recuperation. What the hermeneutics of recuperation also does is work with very essentialist ideas of what the feminine is. So, and those are very Western, contextually specific ideas of the feminine, that the feminine is maternal, that it is in some ways to be feminine is to be submissive, to be maternal, to all of those sort of stereotypes of what femininity is very much part of the hermeneutics of recuperation. So women behaving in womanly ways, and then the Bible being friendly to women is very much the hermeneutics of recuperation. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this when we get to particularly Genesis 2. The hermeneutics of suspicion starts really in the 1980s, and it's related to second wave feminism. which was the feminist movement broadly in Western society that started in the 1960s. So it's slightly later, but it's roughly contemporary with second wave feminism. And the person you see on the screen there is Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza, also still alive, who is a prominent New Testament scholar. And the hermeneutics of suspicion in feminist biblical studies is really synonymous in lots of ways with Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza. And what the hermeneutics of suspicion does is exposes patriarchal, masculinist norms that are underlying biblical texts. It assumes that the biblical texts themselves and the world that produced them come from patriarchy. But what the hermeneutics of suspicion does then is say, okay, all of that, yes, but we're going to put women at the center of the investigation. We're going to center women's concerns. Again, kind of essentializing what women are and making it sort of universal and essential. But instead of maintaining or not critiquing the authority of Scripture, what the hermeneutics of suspicion does is locates authority in the social and cultural contexts of the text's production. And what the hermeneutics of suspicion does, which is a broader hermeneutical movement of the 1980s and later, it basically says the truth is out there, we just have to find it. The object of our study, the text, we should be suspicious of it, that it's trying to cover up things, whether that's the treatment of women, ecological concerns, concerns about racism, whatever. The truth is out there, it just has to be excavated. We have to treat the text suspiciously and try to get at what the text is in itself hiding. So that's the hermeneutics of suspicion. This is the hermeneutics that I began my education in biblical studies in. So I slip into it very naturally. If we think about then moving into the 1990s and subsequently, we are talking about postmodern critiques. We're talking about third, fourth, and fifth wave feminisms, and what we see in this period is feminist biblical scholarship being part of the larger postmodern project that dismantles the norms of modernity and thinks about how do we know what we know? How is meaning made? And here we really start to see the distinction between sex and gender being made. We start seeing questioning the whole concept of what patriarchy is, and is there such a thing as patriarchy? In this particular mode of inquiry, we're interested in the ideological effects of biblical texts. So, what do these texts do to me when I read them? And what we start to see here is feminist criticism overlapping with different other kinds of criticisms like queer criticism, masculinity studies, and so forth. And I can't really place, because of this multiplicity of approaches, I can't put a single biblical scholar associated with it whose name really comes up. So I found this picture of skydivers in all different colorful outfits because we're all just kind of floating around out there doing this stuff. And this takes me to my next point, which is that we also think in this point, starting in the 1990s and going forward in biblical studies, we talk about other kinds of approaches that are gendered to biblical texts. And so we're following trends in other areas of scholarship, in the humanities and social sciences more generally. So we are talking about how race, ethnicity, and gender intersect. So intersectional identities. So we start hearing a lot about womanist biblical interpretation, Africana biblical interpretation, and so forth. We also have turn to the study of men and masculinity studies. and also queer studies. And so I've put some pictures of various different people and projects that were going on in this area. So I'm going to draw a little bit from this work as well in the rest of the presentation. So Genesis 1. Genesis 1 is that amazing text that begins with, in the beginning. And it's got this huge cosmic idea of humanity and humanity's place in the universe. And so I want to turn to the last few verses of the chapter. And all of the translations you're going to see on your screen now are all the ones that I have done that I use in teaching, because I find that the translations don't always get across what I want to get across. And this is where we start to see the intersection between a hermeneutics of recuperation. Yeah, sometimes we're just reading it wrong, and sometimes our translators are just reading it wrong. Hermeneutics of suspicion. Yeah, there's truth out there, and we got to be suspicious of the text that we've got in front of us, including the fact that it's a translation. And thinking about the ideological effects, the effects that these texts have on us as readers in that kind of postmodern movement. So Genesis 1, verses 26 to 27. And one of the things I like to do with students is I like to highlight where we have certain key words being used in particular passages. So I've put them in various beautiful colors there for you to see. So let us make humanity, and God said, let us make humanity in our image and in our likeness. They shall have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the sky, over the beasts of all the earth, over all the creeping things that creep upon the earth. And God created the human in his image. In the image of God, he created it, male and female, he created them. So the little picture I've got there on the side is we've got sort of God in the top big circle, and then we've got the human, male and female, in the two little bottom circles. And there's very much this equality of male and female. He created them. One of the issues that we have in dealing with Hebrew, so this is the recuperation part, we've just been reading it wrong, is that Hebrew has no neuter gender. Hebrew is like French. It has only two grammatical genders, masculine and feminine. So if you want to say, you can't say it in Hebrew, just like you can't say it in French. It's grammatically gendered, either masculine or feminine. And so, so everything is gendered grammatically. So when you're rendering it into English, because English does have a neuter grammatical gender, as does German and many other languages. So in the image of God, he created him is technically correct, except that him, the third person masculine pronoun in Hebrew, can be translated as either him or it. And so I like to go with it here. So this is my recuperation. In the image, we've just been reading it wrong. In the image of God, he created, that's God, created the human, it. And then male and female, he created them. So as we kind of recuperate what we see here in Genesis 1, verses 26 to 27, we see gender being, we can recuperate in our reading of the Hebrew text so that we can see that a text that is often rendered into English as an extremely masculine text is actually not that masculine. It is simply a trick of Hebrew grammar, which is like French grammar, doesn't have a neuter gender. Another thing I want to point out here is that, yes, God is gendered masculine. God is always gendered masculine grammatically in the Bible because God is viewed as a male figure. There is feminine imagery sometimes used of God, not often, but it is there in various biblical texts. But that's imagery, whereas the pronouns themselves that are used for God are always masculine in Hebrew. So I want to just look at, so let us make humanity in our image and our likeness. So I've just said, well, God is masculine. So if we say, let us make humanity in our image, then is not the human a masculine being? And yes, except no, because when we see down in verse 27, the little poem, and this is a little poem, and God created the human in his image, in the image of God, he created it, male and female, he created them. There's kind of this idea that, yes, God is human shaped in a way. God is not disembodied. God has a body. God is in human shape. But human shape in this reading has two forms. There's the male human form and the female human form that are both human. And so one way to think of it is God is, yes, a masculine body shape, but humanity is not. So it sort of, you can see the kind of wrestling with this concept that we have in the writer of this text. One last thing I want to say about this is that male and female, he created them. Male and female is what we call a merismus. It's like north and south. It doesn't mean just north and just south. It means north and south and everything in between. And male and female can also be read as male and female and everything in between. And this is how a number of queer theorists have been, and queer readers of this text have been thinking about this statement about gender, sexuality and gender in Genesis 1. So if the God of Genesis 1 is this cosmic creator God, the God of Genesis 2 and 3 is a gardener. And so I have this image of gardening tools and the garden here, because this is a God who doesn't just speak people into existence or speak everything into existence. This is a God who actually gets down and gets his hands dirty, mucking around making the humans. So I like this image here of Genesis 2 and 3. So this text here has a different vision of how human beings were created. So on the day that Yahweh God made earth and sky, there was no human, which in Hebrew is the word Adam, to work or serve the ground. And ground is Adamah. Adam is a masculine noun, Adamah is a feminine noun. Yahweh God formed the human, not just human, the human, Ha-Adam in Hebrew, out of dust from the ground, Ha-Adamah. He blew into its nose a living breath, and the human became a living being. So this is not a God that simply speaks the human into existence. This is a God who gets down and is the divine gardener or divine potter, makes the human being. Yahweh God planted a garden in Eden in the east and set the human he had formed there. So this is a shaped, formed human being. All right. So then Yahweh God said, it isn't good for the human to be alone. I'll make a corresponding helper for it. And there's a rhyme in Hebrew here, labado and kenegdo. I'll make a corresponding helper for it. And this is the phrase that gets translated as I will make a helpmeet for him or something like that. Please don't do that. Yahweh God formed from the ground again, so making all the little clay animals, all the animals of the field, all the birds of the sky. He brought each one to the human to see what the human would call it, whatever critter came along. Whatever the human called the living being, that was its name. And the human called names for all the beasts and birds of the sky and for all the animals of the field, but the human did not find a corresponding helper. So, you have part A and part B doesn't seem to come from any of these animal bits. So then this is where my own translation, because I like this image of Yahweh God dropping a stupor, sort of thunk, on the human, and it slept. And he, that's God, took one of its sides, not its rib, took one of its sides and closed the flesh under it. Yahweh God built the side which he had taken from the human into a woman, and he brought her to the human. The human said, and here's another little poem, "This one at last is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman, for from man this one was taken." And woman is Isha in Hebrew, and man is Ish. So here, in this little diagram of circles, we have this, God is not in this one. The big circle at the top is the original human, which gets literally cut in half and shaped into two new humans. So that this human that is kind of cut in half and made into two humans is the corresponding helper. So again, this is our hermeneutics of recuperation. We've just been reading it wrong. We're not just taking out a little bit of the man and building it up into a woman. We actually have a splitting of the human into two. And this image is, or this way of thinking about the two bodily forms of human beings is one that we find, for example, in ancient Greek thought from roughly the same time as well, that there was an original human being that then got split into two by the gods and made into one. And we find a kind of weird parody of this concept in a speech in Plato's Symposium by Aristophanes, who makes it kind of ridiculous, but the thought is there. So the human now is, so our original human, which is sexually undifferentiated, then becomes two humans that are sexually differentiated. And that's when the human becomes a man and a woman. So that's what we have here in this image. And then we finally end up with what all this is meant to explain, or what this goes on to explain. So therefore, because of the fact that we have one human that's split into two, therefore a man abandons his father and his mother and clings to his woman, and they become one flesh. And so this is why we have marriage. We have a man and a woman who were originally one being, who were taken apart and are seeking to come back together again. So that's the origin story for marriage in this text. So the two of them were naked. Arumim is the Hebrew word, the human and his woman. And this is where we start to see human kind of becoming masculine. But they did not feel shame before each other because of it. And then I just threw in this last little bit because as we move into chapter 3, the serpent was the shrewdest, and it's a play on words, arum, naked and shrewd, of all the animals of the field which Yahweh God had made. So what we have as we looked at this particular text is we have the hermeneutics of recuperation. We're kind of reading it wrong. If we look at how the Hebrew works here, then we have this suspicion. So we're going to dig down, hermeneutics of suspicion, we're going to dig down underneath and see that there's a kind of a truth out there that as we move into this last little bit, we start seeing the human not being sexually undifferentiated, but now the human being associated with masculinity, the human and his woman. And so that's a kind of, wow, look at this kind of, here's the patriarchy at work now, privileging or equating humanness with maleness or masculinity. And then we get the postmodern critique here or the various different ways of thinking about this, this breakdown of how meaning is constructed by thinking about here how, if I go back to the previous slide, here we are. If we think about how humanness is constructed with respect to differentiating human and animal. And what effect does this differentiation have on us as readers? So that is pretty much what I wanted to talk about today. So thank you for your attention. I look forward to the discussion. You are going to get this PowerPoint sent to you, and at the end of the PowerPoint here, you'll see that I have a little bibliography if you want to follow up on any of this. And so you don't, I guess you could take a picture of your screen now, but you will also get this PowerPoint, and which has got the complete bibliographic references. So you are, of course, invited to look at any of these or all of these items for you. So I haven't got one of Elizabeth Schussler-Fiorenza's books specifically on this, but she's not hard to find. So you can probably find her pieces quite easily. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Christine, first. And we could take the next 20 minutes for a Q&A session. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to type your questions. And I'd like to just start off with a first question. You translated God as he, and you explained about the Hebrew language. Is God male in these stories, and how, and are there ways to read God as other than male?
Yeah, and that's a great question, and I kind of did allude to that, but I want to come back to that because it's a question I get often from students who are committed to conceiving of God in either being without gender or ungendered or something, and how do you do that? How do we do that? And so the way that I kind of approach this, well, it's not kind of, this is the way I approach it. And so this is what I've worked with students in the past, is to say that as a biblical scholar, when I read these texts, God is gendered. It's a male deity, and he's gendered masculine. There is some feminine imagery used of God, but feminine imagery can be used of masculine beings at any time. So so the approach I take is that when I'm studying the text that I love and yet is not all that friendly to women, I use the contextually appropriate pronouns of he and him for God. But in my own devotional and liturgical use, I use ungendered pronouns for God, mostly just saying the really awkward God and God's self, which I know is awkward in English, but that's what I go with. So thank you. I see there are some questions now.
Yeah. The next one is male and female and everything in between. Does each of the human form include everything in between?
That's a great question. I think if you're reading it that way, probably not. we're thinking about, if we think about shapes, maybe physical shapes on a spectrum, and you kind of go from a circle to rectangle kind of thing, and we have ovals and we have rectangles with rounded edges and so forth, and they sort of move along a spectrum, but not that a circle contains within it rectangles, or that a rectangle contains within it circles. If that kind of answers the question for you.
Another question is, could you explain your exegesis for the human being split and not the typical rib?
Yeah. So the word in Hebrew that gets translated as rib is actually a word that just means side. So if you take the side of something, if you drop a stupor onto a human being in this case, and you take its side off and build it up into another human being, and then fix up the bit where you cut off the side, that's where you're making two different human beings. It's kind of like thinking about Siamese twins in a way, although Siamese twins are kind of more clearly two beings, except sometimes there's a one body with two heads, but that's not really what we're talking about. We're talking about kind of one being that gets divided into two, but you gotta do some plastic surgery to fix the place where they were taken apart, which is kind of weird to think about. But another way to think about it is, and I tried to find an image. I wanted to find a graphic that I could put on the slide that would do this. But thinking about taking a circle, and almost like the Asian yin-yang circle. So it's a circle that's got sort of the loop in it. And if you took half of that and then kind of pulled out the side of it to make a full circle. So if you took that full circle, got a curvy line in the middle, you make the split along the curvy line, you've got two things, and then you kind of pull them out each to make a full circle. That's kind of what we're talking about here.
I think because we're so used to the idea of rib, we can't help to think of the side as maybe a little chunk of flesh. Do you think the word side might mean something more significant, or that perhaps it's not such a physical, it's not describing something so physical, but something more metaphorical?
In this text, no, because this is God as the potter and gardener. This is God who gets down and makes things. So it's not metaphorical in this text. It really is taking the one human and doing some radical plastic surgery on it, and making two humans out of the one, and recognizing that you or I could not do that to a human being, but God is God, so God can do that. So that might be a way to think about that.
Thank you. We have another question. How might the language of dominion in Genesis 1 support practices of oppression? What are some of the hermeneutical arguments that support both women and other creative beings in the face of this language?
Yes, so that's and that's where we start getting into thinking about eco-theology, ecological biblical studies. So if we're just thinking about women, the language of dominion is very much that the humans have dominion over the rest of the created order. So it's not that men have dominion over women. And I did not go into the piece in Genesis 3, the aftermath of the eating of the fruit of the tree. But you can do a similar kind of discussion there, where it is, if we're thinking about a hermeneutics of recuperation, reading it wrongly, it's not so much in there that he has dominion over the woman after that as part of the curse. Actually, what he has dominion, what the man has to do is struggle with the ground at that point. That's his curse. The curse for the woman is actually childbearing, which not a heck of a lot of fun, and also extremely dangerous for women. Pre-modern medicine in many ways. So, but yes, in terms of the dominion over the rest of the created order, absolutely that's what the text says. No question about it. People have tried to recuperate the text to make it say that, oh, it's not really dominion, it's something else. No, it really is dominion. Like, the word really does mean that in Hebrew. And but what I usually draw students' attention to is the fact that dominion over the earth, when you're talking about farming with stone and bronze implements, and you're moving earth, if you dig a hole, you're taking the dirt away in baskets, maybe being carried or put on some kind of an ox or donkey or something. We are not talking about the earth movers that they use, for example, in northern Alberta. And so when in the Iron Age, Persian and Hellenistic periods, dominion over the earth is a fantasy in lots of ways. Now, we more modern human beings have can do things that have much greater impact much more quickly on the rest of the created order. So that's dominion.
Next question is, how would you explain patriarchy? Is this part of the fall, hence sinful?
So here is a really interesting piece, because the biblical text, Genesis 2 and 3, that has the fall, that's a Christian reading of the text. It's not the only reading of the text. And it's clear that lots of people for many centuries, including Jews today, of course, do not read this text as being about a fall, that there was a pristine point and then followed by and then sin entered the world, kind of thing. So we have to identify first that that's a Christian reading of the text, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's how Christians read the text. But it's not the only reading of the text. So to say that patriarchy is maybe entered the world with the fall would be a Christian reading of this story, which is completely feasible and doable. But our Jewish sisters would say that patriarchy is not restricted to Christians. So then you need a different explanation as well. A hermeneutics of suspicion would say that has a very pessimistic view of the human condition, and basically says that patriarchy has been around for millennia. It's always been bad, and but if we expose the conditions of patriarchy, then that makes it go away, which hasn't worked yet, but you never know.
Our next question is, does everything in between relate to bisexuality, and what are the implications?
First point, sure. Bisexuality, transgender, however you want to read that. The Hebrew syntax actually supports it. What are the implications? This is where the postmodern in me says, what do you want the implications to be? whose interests are served by various different readings of that text in different ways. And so if you're looking for liberation, that's a hermeneutics of suspicion or a hermeneutics of recuperation. If you're coming at it from a postmodern perspective, you would say something like, sure, and what are the effects then on readers and hearers of thinking about it that way? It's not that... So I'm a professional biblical scholar. One of the things I like to say is I'm a professional biblical scholar, and I can make the biblical text say and do just about anything that you want. It's the Bible itself is polyvalent, and it has many potential meanings held within it. And it is what we bring to it in our reading and thinking about it that shapes what we get out of it. And different readers bring different perspectives. And yeah, I can make these texts do just about anything. It's whether I want to or not, or whether any of us wants to. What do we want from these texts? There's some things that because these texts can do just about anything. So what do you want? And, the old proverb, the devil can quote scripture for his own purposes. Yeah, pretty much. So I can't say that the hermeneutics of recuperation will give you the only way that this text can and should be read. It's one way, but it's not the only way. Can I tell you that anybody who wants to use the Bible to oppress women, to oppress queer people, whoever else the people use Bible to oppress, yeah, they can do that, and I can't stop them, because that stuff's in there, and you can certainly read it that way. So it's, where do you want to place your authority? And in the Reformed tradition, with a very high notion of scriptural authority, that is really hard to wrestle with. And I don't have any easy answers for it.
Mm-hmm. Seems like that gets deep. That gets into the deeper question about hermeneutics. Mm-hmm. The next question is, would a feminist, non-gendered view of God accept the historic Christian doctrine of the Trinity, where God is Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit? Would the creeds be reinterpreted or rewritten in non-gendered terms?
And here we are way out of my area of expertise, because I am not a systematic theologian. I'm not a historical theologian. Questions about the Trinity make me really nervous because I don't know how to answer those. I can tell you that although in traditional Christian doctrine, all of the three persons of the Trinity are all gendered masculine. So, but when we get, so people try to get away from gendered language. And so instead of using Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, they'll use language like Creator, Redeemer, Sustainer. And of course, the knock against that particular formulation is that it's not personal. Those are abstract concepts in a way that that relational words like Father and Son those are so personal, so intimate. So I don't have an answer to that. Sorry, you'll have to track down any friendly systematic theologian to help you with that one.
Thank you. And another question: does the creation of male and female imply that Adam being an androgynous being before the split?
Mm-hmm. Yes, but not androgynous, not containing features of either biological sex. Androgynous as in unsexed, maybe, yes. But I was trying to find, again, this was me, I spent like 2 hours doing this and finally said, Christine, stop it, I was trying to find an image of a human being, like a drawing of a human being with no sexual organs, no sexual characteristics, secondary sex characteristics visible, but just sort of that like a stick figure human kind of thing, but prettier. And because that's kind of what we're talking about, I think.
The next question is, what is a safe term to use in prayer that refers to God as both male and female in our church?
Great question. I use the very clunky God and God self, extremely clunky. English is not a great language for this. Because English does have grammatical gender in its pronouns. There are languages that don't, but English has grammatically gendered pronouns. And until English does not have grammatically gendered pronouns, then we're kind of left going this very clunky route, which so another route to go is to balance. So if you use, if you still want to use gendered language, because again, that relational, intimate kind of language is to balance it. So using he and she, sort of alternating, stuff like that. I would not recommend, and I have never recommended to students or clergy, that you just start doing that one day and sort of hope your congregation comes along for the ride. This is something that requires work and preparation and discussion about and teaching.
Thank you. We do have 1 or 2 minutes left. And please know that for any unanswered questions, Christine has agreed that she will answer all those questions in a follow-up email. So just last question. It says, thank you so much for the interesting talk. I was interested in the rhyming of the Hebrew, in the passage you shared and the play on words. Can this aid our understanding of the passage?
Absolutely. And here's my plug for, hey, learn Hebrew, kids. It's a fascinating language. It's easier than Greek. But yes, we have to remember that these texts were not written as instruction manuals. They were not written to be functional like the manual I have for my microwave. They're beautiful, artistic works created by highly literate and educated scribes who delighted in wordplay and sometimes in visual play. There's some plays that show up if you know the shapes of the letters, and so. Yes, absolutely. These are beautiful texts. They're aesthetically pleasing, and and aesthetically pleasing, both hearing and reading. And they bring joy in how they're put together. I think that's really important. Again, the biblical texts are not like your microwave manual in many different ways. And your microwave manual is not like the Bible in other different ways. And the piece that I've often used with students is that they do different things. You don't expect your Bible to be able to help you to microwave popcorn without burning it. That's not its role. That's not its function. Similarly, you don't expect your microwave manual to provide you with the deep answers to the questions of life and the universe and everything. And part of the deep answers to the deep questions about life, the universe, and everything is about beauty and the beauty of the text. Thank you.
Yeah. I think that's a beautiful way to close our session. Like oftentimes with theological questions, we attempt to dissect the text and figure it out, but that was a very good note, how beautiful the texts are to end our session. So it is time to close our session, and for questions that we could not cover today, they will be answered in a follow-up email. And thank you, Christine, for that engaging session. Thanks to all of you for participating in our conversation today.
Thank you.